Grandparents' Dark Secrets. 3 chilling horror stories.
Story 1: The Watchful Eyes. Old Grandpa Jim had always been a quiet man. Living in the outskirts of a sleepy village, his house stood at the edge of the woods, where few dared to venture after dusk. He and his wife, Granny May, had no children, and their lives had always been marked by solitude. Neighbors rarely visited, save for the occasional delivery of groceries or visits from the town's children who would leave food on the porch. But there was something off about Grandpa Jim's eyes. Dark, deep-set, and far too knowing. People said it was just old age, that his vision had worsened over the years. But there was always a sense that he was watching, waiting. The strange occurrences began one evening when their next-door neighbor Emily noticed that Grandpa Jim's lights were on far past midnight. Curious and slightly concerned for the elderly couple, she walked over to check on them. She knocked softly on the door, but there was no response. The wind howled through the trees, making her feel more uneasy. Just as she was about to turn away, the door creaked open on its own. Stepping inside, she called out, "Grandpa Jim? Granny May? Are you all right?" The house was cold, much colder than it should have been. The fire in the hearth had long since gone out, and a thick layer of dust had settled on the furniture. It was as if the couple hadn't been there in days. But then, Emily heard something faint, a soft whisper coming from the direction of the staircase. "Help! Help us!" The voice rasped, low and cracked. Trembling, Emily ascended the stairs slowly. At the top, she turned to the right into a room that had once been the couple's bedroom. The air was thick with a musty scent, and the bed lay untouched, its blankets perfectly folded. But there, sitting in the corner, was Grandpa Jim. His eyes gleamed unnaturally, wide and staring. And beside him sat Granny May, except she wasn't alive. Her skin was pale and her features gaunt, as if she had been dead for weeks. But she was sitting upright, her mouth moving in slow, deliberate motions. "Get out of here, Emily," Grandpa Jim said in a voice that was too deep, too smooth for his age. "She's gone, but she watches now, watches everything. She won't let anyone leave." Emily took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. What are you talking about?" A cold chill settled around her. "She's angry, Emily," Jim whispered, eyes gleaming darkly. "And you've disturbed her. Now she'll have you too." Suddenly, Emily's vision blurred. The room seemed to shift. The walls closed in, and the door she had entered through disappeared. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Before her, Granny May's lifeless eyes blinked open, and the room seemed to warp, the shadows thickening as if alive. Grandpa Jim chuckled softly as his wife's cold hand reached out to touch Emily's face.
Story 2: The Hidden Cellar. It was a rainy, dreary day when Sarah and her husband, Tom, decided to visit his grandparents' old farmhouse. They had never been particularly close to Grandpa Bert and Grandma Helen, but they felt a strange obligation to check on them after hearing that the couple had been getting ill. The house, nestled deep in the countryside, was as weathered as its inhabitants. It seemed as though time had slowly devoured it, peeling paint, warped wooden beams, and windows too dirty to see through clearly. But as they walked inside, Sarah couldn't shake the sense of dread that settled in her chest. Grandpa Bert sat in his favorite chair by the fire, his long white beard draped over his chest, his eyes hidden beneath a heavy brow. Grandma Helen, was nowhere to be seen. Tom greeted his grandfather warmly, but Grandpa Bert just grunted in response, his eyes unfocused and distant. "Where's Grandma Helen?" Sarah asked softly, glancing around. Bert's gaze shifted toward the floor. "Downstairs," he muttered. "She's been getting worse. Sometimes she's not herself." Sarah and Tom exchanged a glance. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" Grandpa Bert didn't respond at first. He just stared into the fire, his eyes narrowing with something Sarah couldn't quite place. "You won't want to go down there," he warned. "Best leave her be." Despite his warning, Sarah was curious. As the hours passed and night fell, she couldn't stop thinking about the cellar. There was something unnerving about it, something hidden away in the dark. Finally, when Tom went to bed, Sarah slipped quietly downstairs to the cellar door. It was locked, but she found an old rusted key on the kitchen counter and used it to open the door. The stairs creaked beneath her feet as she descended into the damp, musty darkness. The air was heavy, with a strange scent, and she could hear faint noises, scratching, shuffling. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a small, low-ceilinged room. The walls were lined with strange markings, symbols that seemed both ancient and familiar. And in the far corner of the room, standing motionless, was Grandma Helen. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her lips stretched into a grotesque, silent scream. She had been altered, her body thin and contorted, her limbs too long. The very air seemed to pulse with a wrongness, as if the room itself was alive. Grandma Helen turned slowly to face Sarah, her mouth opening in a dry hiss. "You shouldn't have come down here," she rasped. "You've brought the curse." Before Sarah could react, something shifted in the shadows, something that wasn't quite human. It was an ancient, writhing thing, born of flesh and darkness, and it reached out for her. Story 3. The Echo of the Past. Maggie had always known that her grandparents' house was a little odd. It was a sprawling, old Victorian home that creaked and groaned with age, full of dark hallways and forgotten rooms. Grandma Edith and Grandpa Frank had lived there for as long as she could remember, and yet it was as if they were the only ones who truly belonged to the house. One summer, after Grandpa Frank passed away, Maggie decided to spend some time with Grandma Edith. She wanted to make sure her grandmother wasn't feeling too lonely. But something had changed. Grandma Edith seemed different. Her once sharp mind was now clouded, and she often spoke of seeing things, hearing voices at night. The house felt colder, darker, as if it was rejecting her presence. Maggie tried to comfort her grandmother, but at night, she often woke to the sound of strange, hollow footsteps echoing through the halls. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but the more she listened, the more it felt like something, was walking in the shadows. One night, Maggie followed the footsteps, her heart pounding in her chest. She crept down the darkened hallway toward the old study, where Grandma Edith kept a collection of old journals and trinkets. But as she entered the room, she saw something that made her freeze in place. Sitting in the rocking chair by the window was Grandpa Frank. But he was not the man she remembered. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes were wide open, staring at her with an unsettling, unnatural intensity. "Grandpa," Maggie whispered, unsure of whether she was dreaming or awake. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it rocked slowly back and forth, its gaze never leaving her. Suddenly, Grandma Edith appeared in the doorway. "Maggie, what are you doing in here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Maggie turned to her grandmother, but when she looked back at the chair, Grandpa Frank was gone. Only the creaking of the old chair remained, as if it had never stopped rocking. Grandma Edith stepped closer, her eyes wild with fear. "You saw him too, didn't you?" she whispered. "He's back. He never left, Maggie. He's always been here." From that night onward, Maggie began to hear whispers in the walls and see fleeting figures out of the corner of her eye. The house had become a prison, a place where the dead never truly left, and the living were trapped by the echoes of the past.